today. I'll start my sharing. Okay, we got a lot to get through today. I'm so glad you all are here. We are taking on Exodus. So let me do this little slideshow here. So we're going to do this over 5 classes. So starting today, the next 4 weeks in October, and then a week in November. So here's the reading plan. We're taking a couple chapters each week. This week, we're going to dive into the background and context and start Moses. Moses is going to take us 2 parts. And then we're going to go into Passover, leaving. This is all, again, that story of getting out of Egypt and struggling. Next part is the giving of the law, and then the rebellion and moving forward. So, Exodus. I think here's something to keep in mind as we go through this. This book is all about one key theme, which is God rescuing God's people. That is the foundation of this book. It is the foundation of the relationship. I will take you to be my people. I will be your God. These are echoes of everything we've already heard in Genesis for those of you who were with me in Genesis. God is rescuing God's people. Okay, a couple of little background things on Genesis, or on Exodus. I got to get my head around that one. We are switching books. So it's the second book of the Torah, or the Pentateuch. So those are the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. This is number 2. We did Genesis last year. Following this is Numbers and Leviticus and Deuteronomy. I don't know if we're going to dive into those. Those are hard books. This book takes the Israelites from where we left off in Genesis, where they had gone into Egypt. But what happens is they have become enslaved. And it goes from that story of enslavement, freedom, all the way up to the giving of the law, which we'll talk about as the 10 Commandments, all the way leading up into Leviticus and Numbers. Here are kind of the central moments, the big things we're going to encounter: the bondage, the plagues, the Passover, the Exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the sea, the divine revelation and the law giving at Sinai, and the story of the golden calf. That's what takes us through the bulk of Exodus. Or if you have ever seen that Charlton Heston movie, all of these big plot points should feel very familiar to you. If you have not seen it, it's worth Googling and watching. Okay, so in Genesis, we started the story of the patriarchs, right? And we ended with Joseph going down into Egypt. And just like Genesis, Exodus is a weird book. It is not a beautifully composed, well-written, goes from point A to point B. Exodus is very similar, like all the other books in the Pentateuch, in that there are multiple authors. In Exodus, we're going to encounter 3 different authors, 3 different people who are going to tell this story of Israel, and each one of them is going to have a different perspective, theologically and literally. Sometimes it'll be hard to tease out that it's a different writer. Sometimes it'll be very jarring, and you'll have this moment where you think, I just read this. I just read this. That will happen very frequently in Exodus. So one person, biblical scholars think that, there was a scribe who took all those different narratives and put them together and wove them into this continuous narrative that we know of Exodus, right? That person seems to have taken a lot of care to preserve as much of those 3 source materials as possible. So they didn't operate as an editor, which would have been, beneficial for us centuries later, right? It would have been a much easier read. They didn't do that. They preserved all those different A, B, and C perspectives. And that's going to make reading Exodus a little challenging. So that's a lot of the difficulties that we're going to experience in Exodus. There's going to be contradictions, there's going to be repetitions, and there are going to be differing narratives throughout this. It's going to be a tough one. So just think of Exodus not as one book, but as 3 different books that woven together. And they're telling one story 3 different ways. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about whether or not it happened. So the big story, right, of Exodus is they get out of Egypt. It's this narrative of dramatic, very dramatic, right? So you have millions of people packing up at a moment's notice, getting out, fleeing across the Red Sea while they're being pursued, and then for years going through the desert to the promised land. That's the story that we're going to encounter, right? But did it happen? So archaeologists have pretty much ruled out the possibility that this type of national exodus, as described in the Bible, happened. So it probably didn't. So there's no historical record of the enslavement of an entire foreign population. There's no record of the departure of an enslaved population of Israelites. There's no records of a miraculous plagues. And remember, the Egyptians kept meticulous historical records, and there's nothing there. There's not a single archaeological find in the Sinai desert that would indicate this mass of humanity moved through the desert. There's no evidence of the conquest of Canaan by the incoming Israelites. So there is no historical evidence for any of this. That being said, there's a lot of reasons to believe that it's not a complete invention. And the biggest argument for this is what biblical scholars describe as like the concept of embarrassment. And in that it's really hard to imagine anyone telling a story unless it had a grain of truth in it, a grain that could be avoided. This is an embarrassing story. It's the beginning of Israel's history as a nation, and it begins in enslavement. And so that's why the biblical scholars think there's a bit of truth to this story. So even though we can't substantiate it through historical documents, we do have some evidence for the enslavement of Israelites in Egypt in small numbers at various times in Egyptian history. So it does exist in the historical record, but in small numbers throughout Egyptian history. So again, if you go back to the Egyptian historical records, if you have records of it occurring in small pieces throughout the historical record, then one would assume that if it occurred at a mass level of 2 million people living, of course it would have existed in the historical record. It doesn't. But it does exist in the historical record of enslavement of the Semitic people at small numbers at different parts of time. And the historical record does describe some of those slaves escaping, no more than a handful at a time. So the most we can say with any measure of probability about the historical accuracy of the Exodus is that some Semitic bands left this enslavement in Egypt and made their way through the desert to Canaan, where they joined up with the emerging Israelite population in the hill country. So again, the promised land is filled with Canaanites. That is their home, right? So that's the best we can say. It happens over a couple generations, and the story grows and it grows. So, but that's the story that we're interested in. And so regardless of whether or not it occurred, we're not going to ask, is it true, but how is it true? So that's the question we're going to ask. And that's a quote by Will Gaffney, who is a wonderful biblical scholar. So that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time with over the next 5, is looking for the truth in these stories. Roughly, here's how it's going to play out. There's kind of it's a story in 2 parts. First part is Israel in Egypt. That's going to take us chapters 1 through 15. Second is, we're going to get to Mount Sinai, 16 to 40. Okay, here's what is about to happen. Now, every week when we start, I'll give you a little refresher about what we did last week, and then a little preview about what's going to happen. In the ones we're going to hit today, chapters 1 through 5, the Israelite population has grown. Pharaoh, who did not know Joseph, so time has passed since the story ended in Genesis. This new Pharaoh is going to get threatened by their numbers and is going to enslave them. Out of that situation, Moses is born, raised in privilege, exiled, married, and has a child. And then Moses is going to encounter God on the mountaintop and get this call to go free God's people, and he's going to head back to Egypt. And there he's going to meet with Pharaoh and demand that God's people be freed. Pharaoh is going to decline said offer, and things are going to go downhill from there. So we're going to leave it on kind of a low note in Moses' story today. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to just stop there and just check in. Any general question? Hi, Shirley, welcome. Any general questions of anybody on Exodus before we dive in? Go ahead, Taylor.
Forgot that the thing was broken. Anyway, I would like to know if you would be willing to send out your slides afterwards.
You bet.
Thank you. I'm too slow taking notes. Appreciate it.
No worries. I'm happy to do that. Anybody else? Everybody all good? Ready to dive in? Okay. Let's start with Exodus 1, chapter 15 through 22. Would anybody like to read this one?
I will.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Chris, and then Tony will have you read the next one.
Okay.
The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on their delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. The midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people: "Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live."
Thanks, Chris. Okay, so again, this Pharaoh does not know Joseph. So this is a Pharaoh who has no connection to the Israelite people, no connection to that story of Joseph, and has enslaved the Israelite people and orders, and their numbers have grown too high. So Pharaoh is going to order the Hebrew midwives to kill the male children. So that's a picture of the midwives. Oh, you know what? I dropped off the other piece of this, which is the piece where the next piece that happens. So what happens next is the midwives basically con Pharaoh and come up with a way to trick Pharaoh and don't participate in his plan of murder. That being said, Moses's mother gives birth, and figures out a way to place the baby in a papyrus basket and float him in the Nile. She sends her daughter, Miriam, to go follow, and the baby is picked up by Pharaoh's daughter. And then they see Miriam and they tell her to go get a wet nurse. So Miriam goes and gets the mom and convinces and brings her back to be the wet nurse. So Moses stays with his mom and his sister, even though he's been given up. Once he's been weaned, though, Moses is taken into Pharaoh's palace. So what that means is that Moses does not experience any of the enslavement, the hard labor, is raised in a position of privilege within Pharaoh's palace. So just like many of the stories in the Hebrew scripture, this one has a lot of parallels to other legends that existed among ancient people. And there is one for Sargon of Akkad, who lived about 1,000 years before Moses. So it's really likely that this origin story of Moses draws on that story that was probably well known in ancient times. So as you think forward into the New Testament and you think about the origin stories of Jesus that we're going to find in Matthew and Luke, we know that it was understood that an individual who would go on to do great things probably had a miraculous origin story. And so it makes sense that Moses had one, and that legend lines up with other legends in that time. Okay, let's go on to grown-up Moses. Tony, will you read that one?
Sure. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well.
Thanks, Tony. Okay, so clearly Moses knew from where he came, right? So Moses knows his story. He knows where his allegiances lie. He sees this Egyptian taskmaster beating a Hebrew, and so he kills him secretly. We're going to come back to this story in our question for reflection. So hold on to this story as we progress. But his actions don't win him any plaudits from those he was seeking to protect. And when he tries to break up a fight between two of them, basically they say, "Look, who put you in charge? If I don't behave, you're going to kill me like you killed the Egyptian." So, and clearly the word got out that Moses had killed the Egyptian. He wasn't as sneak as he thought he was. And the upshot is Moses has to flee from Egypt. So he runs and he settles in the land of Midian. So that is east of the Gulf of Arabia. It's actually in modern day Saudi Arabia. And there he marries the daughter of the priest of Midian. So he is basically a refugee. Okay, who would like to read that one?
I will.
Thanks, Diane.
Moses agreed to stay with the man who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become a foreigner in a foreign land." During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them.
Okay, so those of you that did Genesis with me, think back to that language of the covenant. It was so strong. God made that covenant with Abraham, and we heard it over and over and over, this language of covenant. So here you're seeing God stepping up to that covenant. God's people are in danger, and God has to respond. Diane, will you just keep reading this one then?
Sure. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the city of the Israelites has reached me, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt.
Thanks, Diane. This is one of my favorite pictures of that one. What's his name? He's a Jewish painter. Chagall. This is Chagall's painting. Okay, so in Exodus 3, this is where we first really encounter two different sources, and they're woven together because it's kind of a confusing read, right? So twice God says he's heard the call of the Israelites, and twice he says he's going to take them out of Egypt. In some places, it says that Moses is sent to free the people. In others, it's that God is going to go and free the people, right? In one strand, Moses receives an auditory, so he hears God. In the other, it's a visual. So this is in Exodus 3 is where you're starting to see, remember, it's not one book, it's 3 books by 3 different authors weaving it together, okay? So before we go on, I want to talk a little bit about this call story here. Now, some of you might have done Isaiah with me a long time ago, and this should be pretty familiar in terms of the essentials of a call story that we see in Isaiah, we'll see in all the prophets to come, which is there's some type of, there's kind of some key plot elements in a call story. And that is God appears in some form to the individuals. And there's almost always a response similar to, here I am, here I am. And then there is basically the fear. There's this fear of, whoa, too much, or I'm not qualified, or there's fear on behalf of the individual called. And then there's kind of the mission. Here's what I want you to do. These elements you'll see repeated we saw them in Isaiah. You can see them in all of the different stories of the prophets that are to come in the Hebrew scriptures. Okay, so let's go on with Exodus then. And remember, we're hearing 3 different authors here. So somebody want to read this one?
I can.
Thanks, Shirley.
And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask him, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey.
Thanks, Shirley. So duplicative language. And basically, what's happening here is God's giving Moses his credentials, his letter of introduction. So how is Moses going to convince these people that they have to listen to him? God's saying, you tell him who sent you, and then he's giving him his credentials. I'm the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Okay. The patriarchs that we have all met before. Okay, so the key element here is, what is God promising to do in the future? God is going to take God's people out of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, blah, 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 blah. In effect, God's going to deliver on the promise God made way back in Genesis. I'm going to make this come true, right? So God has heard the call. God has heard the call of the suffering in Egypt, and God is going to respond. And from this point forward, Yahweh is going to be worshipped as the God who delivered the Israelites from Egypt. Here's the burning bush. Okay, I want to talk for a second about where was the burning bush. So it's in Mount Sinai, which is in the Sinai. It's in the Sinai Peninsula. These mountains are sacred sites for Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And I want to stop and talk about that because damn if it hasn't been a brutal week in the Middle East right now. Okay, so things are very hard. And I search for stories of peace and community where I can find them. And there's one embedded here. So here we have down in the lower right-hand corner where Mount Sinai is. Here's what it actually looks like. There is a monastery at the base of this. So I want to make sure we recall and we keep front and center that the books, that Genesis and Exodus, these stories are held sacred by the 3 big faith traditions, Jewish, Christian, and Muslim. So all 3 hold sacred these stories. And so Moses within Islam is viewed as a prophet and honored and venerated. So Mount Sinai as the place where, as we proceed in the story, that's where Moses first encountered God. That's where Moses is going to bring God's people as they come out of Egypt. They're going to go to Mount Sinai. They're going to come back. And that's where God's going to hand off the 10 Commandments. This place is very sacred in all 3 faith traditions. And at the foot of this mountain is the world's oldest continuously operating monastery, Christian monastery. What's really unique about this is there is a mosque within that monastery, and that Christians, Jews, and Muslims have been living in peace in this community for centuries. And Muhammad actually visited the monastery and issued a document protecting the monastery and exempting them from military service and taxes. So that monastery has been under special protection since the 6th century. So just one, keep in mind, as we are going through these ancient stories, the echoes live on in everything you're experiencing in the news stories flowing out of the Middle East today, in horrifying ways, but also in beautiful ways where community does exist and continue to flourish between all these faith traditions. Okay, Exodus 4. Who would like to read that one?
I will.
Thanks, Chris.
Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." The Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? What makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? It is not I. Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." But Moses said, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else."
So Moses doesn't really want the job. Moses, like many of the prophets, doesn't feel qualified. Moses has speech issues. He has feelings of inadequacy, and God just wants nothing to do with that. God's like, "I told you what to do, Moses. You need to go do it." And this isn't the first time. This isn't the last time Moses is going to push back, right? But God's going to reassure, and Moses is still going to struggle, and Moses is going to push back. So Exodus 4 will go on where God's going to actually prove again God's credential to support Moses in this task. And he's going to do some signs, like a staff is going to become a snake, and his hand's going to become white and then turn back to normal. These are all previews of what's going to come in Egypt. So these are all kind of advanced copies of what we're about to see. And finally, God has just had enough. It's like, get going on the road, move on, Moses. And he does. So Moses leaves finally and heads back to Egypt with his wife and his son. Now, Moses is not forthcoming with his father-in-law. He tells him that he is going to see his family. So this is really not clear why he does this. He lies. Now Moses is on a special mission from God. But he doesn't feel that he doesn't share this with his father-in-law. Along the way, God tries to kill him, and his wife saves them. So at this point in time, you should have stopped reading and went, "What?" This will not be the weirdest curveball you experience in this book. Most scholars think this story is meant to mirror Jacob's story at the side of the river. So remember Jacob heading back. He encounters God at the side of the river and they wrestle. So most scholars find a lot of parallels between that odd story of God trying to kill him and his wife saving him and that one. Moses reunites with his brother, who's going to play a big role later on, and he goes to the elders to convince them that God is coming to deliver them. So again, he has his marching orders. He knows who sent him, and now he has to convince everybody else that he's doing that. And he goes to the elders first, who are kind of like, "Yeah, let's see what you can do." And then he goes to Pharaoh. Who wants to read about Moses's first encounter with Pharaoh?
I will.
Thank you.
Afterwards, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to you in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people: "You are no longer to supply the people with the straw to make bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.' Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies."
Okay, so this did not go as Moses had hoped, right? And remember, at this point in time, there are a lot of gods. There's a lot of gods, right? So Moses comes and says, "Look, God said let him go." And Pharaoh's like, "What God? Who is this God? I don't know this God." And Pharaoh turns around and makes life worse for the Israelites because of what Moses did. So, Tony, will you keep reading?
The Israelite overseers realized that they were in trouble when they were told, "You are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day." When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, "May the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses returned to the Lord and said, "Why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on these people? This is why you sent me? Ever since I went to the Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all."
But he's a little mouthy, right? So like Moses, things don't go well for Moses, and he takes it right back to God and mouths off to God. So nobody's really, really happy here, right? And it doesn't end well. It really, really doesn't end well. So I want to go back to just this piece right here, this statement about the Israelites being lazy. That is one of those pieces of biblical text that you can kind of map back and see it through the centuries in anti-Semitic ways of the Jews being lazy. So that's one of those kind of ugly texts that have lived out in very ugly ways for the Jewish people right there. So, but this section, taking us to the end of 5, is going to end up with things just going from bad to worse for the enslaved Israelites. And Moses is failing. He's failing bad. And so he has gone back and he started yelling at God because God has screwed it up. So not a favorable place. You know, this at the end of this, you can't really imagine Moses leading 2 million people out of Egypt at where we're going to leave it today. Okay. Okay, now I'm going to break you up into small groups. So I want you to go back to that story where he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the stand. So, and I want you to, in small groups, think about whether or not Moses was justified in killing the Egyptian. How can we think about his actions with his role as him being the hero of this story? And the biggest question is violence justified in the face of oppression? So I'm going to stop sharing and just send you out into breakout groups. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to send you out into 2 breakout groups. Give me 1 second to do that. Okay, so again, the question I want you to wrestle with is Moses justified in killing the Egyptian? And the biggest question, is violence justified in the face of oppression? Okay, got it? I'm going to give you just about 9 minutes to do that. You'll have 8 people in, or 4 people in each group, okay? And then I'll see you back here.
Oh,
Okay, who's got the answer? Is violence ever justified?
it sure was back in that time,
Was-
including that brought up a question. Remember in chapter 4 where they were trekking back to Egypt and God appears and decides to kill Moses just right out of the blue. And there's nothing else. There's just that one line.
Yeah,
At the lodging place on his way, Lord met him and sought to kill him.
yeah.
Why?
Oh, that's the one that I was saying is they think is tied to Jacob's story. That's the
Oh, okay.
yeah. It's a very, very timely question with what's happening in the Middle East right now, right?
Exactly.
It's an incredibly timely question. It's one people are living and dying over right now.
Literally.
Literally, with what's going on in the Gaza and everything down there.
Mm-hmm.
So anybody come up with an answer for it?
Well, we talked about since, time began, killing has been condoned and been the way of life, including our own history of wars and our own enslavement of and killing of the Native Americans, enslaving of the Black population, and calling people lazy and killing them for being accused of stealing something, maybe food. I mean, it's rampant.
Yeah.
And I mentioned about the stand your ground law in Florida, that you can kill somebody who's threatening your property or whatever, and there's no punishment for it.
Yeah.
So it's
In our country, it's okay for everybody to have a gun. I mean, what do you use a gun for? So it's,
What confuses me is how people that want a stand your ground law can also be pro-life. It's the same contingency, that is the far right that's pro-life, but they also want people to have guns and
if you don't agree with me, I'll shoot you.
Right.
it's very confusing,
So it is justified in all societies.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, we all have great rationalizations.
Yeah, and we put people to death in gas chambers.
Yeah. Well, it's a tough question. It's time for you to get down, Stella. It's a tough question, and it's one that's being played out. In
Yeah, and
right now. And
it doesn't really seem to have any answers.
being
I-
played out with a vengeance.
Yeah, I think it defies easy answers. We're talking about, centuries and centuries of reactions, long histories of struggles and feeling slighted and feeling fearful. And you know, this story that we're in, Exodus, is a story about a people going in and taking over the promised land.
Which was somebody else's.
Of the blah, 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 you know?
People who live there. So not very dissimilar from what's going to happen after the end of World War II.
Mhm.
And the Israelites and the Palestinians who are on that land when it's given to Israel.
Mhm.
Well, but we were talking in our group about the huge isn't big enough word, incredibly atrociously awful mistake that the French and the British made after World War I, when they essentially carved up the Middle East and where the lines were going to be, and had been tribal country before, or nomadic country before that. And there was a lot of peaceful living at that point in time.
Yeah.
And it was just ripped to pieces after those huge mistakes of World War I. And then after World War II, of course, it was compounded with the actual state of Israel. But it's a series of mistakes, sometimes in that case, made by outsiders. Can I mention one story I remember of where it was working so well?
Mhm.
And this was some years back, not too many years back, on 60 Minutes. One time I had a section on an orchestra, and the orchestra was made up of people from the Gaza who were Arabic, and the people and Jewish, and from Israelis. I'm sorry, I'm getting my tongue tangled up here. Anyway, we had people from both groups, and they played in this orchestra together. And the mission of the orchestra was not to talk politics. There's not even particularly to talk. It was to play music together. And that's what they did, and they were highly successful. And I've often wondered, you know, recently here, does the orchestra still exist? And I don't know, but it was just presented as, here's a microcosm of some little place where people were meeting, and their cultural background, their religious background was not foremost in their mind, but rather music. And we all know that music engages a different part of the brain. So it's just something I remember.
No. I want to close today. So next week we're doing 6 to 11. So we'll keep going with Moses's story, but I want to close today with something that a friend of mine posted, and this is from Reverend David Miller, and I think it's quite beautiful. Our hearts so often broken by our inhumanity to each other, already so bruised by the unnecessary brutality of dictators and our own internal conflicts, is now again still, adding the pain and sorrow of those so brutally damaged in the Middle East by those ongoing differences, breed such endless and senseless destruction. To assume any clear answers feels foolish. To give up hope feels tempting. To tremble in the midst of horror feels completely understandable. To stop trying to birth love in the world feels unacceptable. I'll say that again. To stop trying to birth love in the world feels unacceptable. So I'll include that when I send out the slides today. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Marci.
Thank you all for coming today. We'll do this again next week.
Yeah.
Bye,
Okay.
everybody.